At the turn of the 20th century, the United States realized there's a lot of imperialism that could take place right in our own backyard down in Latin America. How exactly did we do that and take advantage of it? Stick around because that's what we're going to talk about today on Mr. E's Classroom. Hey ladies and gentlemen, today's topic is the United States and Latin America. We're going to try our best to answer the question, what actions did the United States take to achieve its imperialist goals in Latin America? So pay attention to the video and hopefully you'll have an answer at the end. Let's start off by talking about Puerto Rico. Just in case you weren't sure where Puerto Rico is, take a look at this map. If you'll remember, Puerto Rico was one of the territories the United States gained after the Spanish-American War. So what happened to it after that war? Well, the short and easy answer is it fell under military control for quite a while. Most native Puerto Ricans were looking for one of two things. Either they wanted their own independence or they wanted to see Puerto Rico gain statehood. The United States was really kind of reluctant to give Puerto Rico statehood because that would kind of go against the whole idea of imperialism and having territories. But Puerto Rico was very strategically located in the Caribbean, so they were also very reluctant to give it up. In 1900, the United States passed a thing called the Foraker Act. This was meant to kind of end the military rule of Puerto Rico. It established a civilian government. This civilian government, though, wasn't what we would really think of a U.S. government being, because most of the people involved in the government, the governor and most of the legislature, were actually appointed by the President of the United States. Another thing that the Foraker Act really did was it basically said that any native Puerto Rican wasn't considered a U.S. citizen. Even though Puerto Rico was a U.S. territory, the native population were not considered citizens. It would take quite a while before Puerto Ricans gained U.S. citizenship. Let's also talk a little bit about Cuba. You remember Cuba, right? Cuba was the reason we fought the Spanish-American War. Technically, Cuba was independent after the Spanish-American War. I say technically because of a thing called the Platt Amendment. In order for Cuba to get its independence, the United States required them to include a thing called the Platt Amendment in their new constitution. The Platt Amendment made Cuba a protectorate. Basically what that meant was that Cuba would rely on the United States for any kind of defense or protection. The Platt Amendment also gave the United States the rights to Guantanamo Bay, where they would have a permanent naval station. Finally, under the Platt Amendment, the United States had the right to intervene in Cuban affairs whenever it saw fit. This was kind of the United States' way of maintaining control of Cuba without actually having to call Cuba a territory. Speak softly and carry a big stick. This is an old African proverb that President Theodore Roosevelt used as kind of the backbone of his foreign policy and how he dealt with other Latin American countries. Roosevelt used what was called big stick diplomacy. It goes back to that African proverb. Roosevelt tried to use words whenever possible and talk his way into getting what he wanted for the United States. But he was always ready to back up what he was saying with some sort of force if necessary. This required the United States to have an incredibly strong military in order to achieve its goals. For Roosevelt, the big stick was the U.S. Navy. Roosevelt saw a need for some sort of balance of power in Latin America. He saw the United States' responsibility for protecting smaller and less civilized countries in the region. This is where we get the Roosevelt Corollary. President Roosevelt decided that the Monroe Doctrine needed to be updated. If you remember, the Monroe Doctrine was that kind of thing that guided America and basically saying that European powers were going to stay over on their side of the Atlantic and the United States was going to stay on its side of the Atlantic. Roosevelt took it a little bit further and said that the United States would also act as a police power in Latin America. The United States would act in the case of what he called chronic wrongdoing. If these new Latin American countries started to cause some problems, or if other powers were coming in causing problems, then the United States would step in Roosevelt saw this as necessary because a lot of European powers were trying to weasel their way into newly forming Latin American governments. Basically what happened was European countries would make monetary loans or some sort of material type loans to these small countries, knowing full well that the countries would never be able to totally repay. And when those countries couldn't repay, the European countries saw this as a way they could step in. Roosevelt says that we're not going to do that. Remember, you're going to stay on your side, we're going to stay on our side because Latin America is here, we're going to deal with this. For the most part, the Latin American response to this new Roosevelt Corollary was not very positive. If you take a look at this cartoon right here, it really sums up how Latin American countries felt about the Corollary. Many of them saw this as Roosevelt's way of just kind of toying around in the region, as though it was kind of his personal playbox or sandbox. This brings us to the Panama Canal, or perhaps the ultimate show of American imperialism in Latin America. A man, a plan, Panama. This phrase really speaks to how Roosevelt looked at imperialism. When there was something that Roosevelt wanted somewhere, he would put together a plan, he would make it happen. Roosevelt saw the Panama Canal as something very necessary for the United States. With a canal across the Isthmus of Panama, basically connecting the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans, it would cut roughly 8,000 miles off of a coast-to-coast journey if, say, you're going from New York City to San Francisco, California. This was also incredibly strategic for the U.S. Navy. With a canal, it meant that Roosevelt could move around his big stick anywhere that it was needed relatively quickly. Roosevelt tried several times unsuccessfully to convince Colombia to allow him to basically cut a canal across the Isthmus of Panama. Back then, Colombia owned that section of land. Well, it turns out that the Colombian government just wanted way too much money for the land to be able to carve out that canal. Roosevelt also knew that the Panamanians, the people that lived in that section of Colombia, desperately wanted their own country. So he kind of struck up a deal with the Panamanians. I'll help you get your independence if you let me create my canal. And that's exactly what happened. The U.S. sent some warships down to the area to basically back up the Panamanian rebels. The United States also supplied them with some arms and basically told the Colombians that if you don't let the Panamanians have their independence, you're going to wind up dealing with more than just the Panamanians rebelling. You'll have to deal with us as well. The Colombians very quickly kind of backed down. Panama became its own country, and Roosevelt was allowed to start building the Panama Canal. Now, building a canal across the Isthmus of Panama wasn't a cheap thing. Right from the get-go, the United States had to shell out $10 million for what was referred to as the Canal Zone. Basically, the reason we paid this much for that land was roughly to help the Panamanians set up their new government. After the canal was finished, we also entered into an agreement with the Panamanians that we would rent this canal zone from them for $250,000 annually for the next 100 years. That's pretty pricey, especially for the time, but remember the Panamanians also had a brand new government they had to start to establish. Additionally, we also kind of had to smooth things over with the Colombians. They were not very happy with the United States, us allowing part of their country to split off. That cost us an additional $25 million. Here's some more fun stats about the canal. It took roughly 35,000 people to help dig this canal. A good majority of it was done by hand. This work was incredibly dangerous and very hard, and roughly about 5,600 workers wound up dying on the job, mostly from things like tropical diseases like malaria and also from workplace accidents. The canal officially opened in 1914. It took 10 years to finish. It also cost an additional $345 million. That's on top of the $10 million we paid Panama and the $25 million we paid Colombia. So Roosevelt used what he called big stick diplomacy. Basically, he used force to get what he wanted for the United States. But how did presidents after Roosevelt get what they wanted for the United States as far as imperialism goes. Well, the next president, President Taft, the same guy that was the governor of the Philippines, he used what was called dollar diplomacy. He thought that investing money in Latin American countries would really help improve relations. And Taft knew that if he really needed to, he could also rely on the military. This worked relatively well. Taft got what he wanted from those Latin American countries, but let's face it, if somebody comes around and offers you a big giant sack of money to do something, and you're a poor, small country, you're going to take the money and use that for whatever you need, right? The next president after Taft was a guy named Woodrow Wilson. Here's what Wilson had to say about American imperialism. We must prove ourselves Latin America's friend and champion upon terms of equality and honor. We must show ourselves friends by comprehending their interests, whether it squares with our own interests or not. Comprehension must be the soil in which we shall grow all the fruits of friendship. I mean the development of constitutional liberty in the world. Basically what Wilson's saying is that the United States is done with imperialism. We're not going to look at our own kind of goals and things that the United States wants. We're going to start looking at what do these Latin American countries want. Wilson used what was called moral diplomacy. He was determined to take foreign policy in a new direction, to basically end this idea of imperialism for the United States. Wilson promised to never again seek one additional square foot of territory by conquest. Now, side note, if it happened to fall into his lap, he'd be happy to take it. He just wasn't going to actively go out and seek it. Wilson decided he would rather promote human rights and integrity and opportunity over American imperialist ideas. Now, despite all of Wilson's good intentions, he did still occasionally use the military when necessary to get his way. There are some things that happened specifically in Mexico that we don't need to get into right now. So what exactly do we need to take away from this video? Number one, the United States continued to control territories it fought Spain for, even if it was indirectly. Number two, remember Roosevelt's big stick policy. Always be sure you can back up your words with a big giant battleship. Number three, post-Roosevelt, U.S. foreign policy moved towards asking instead of telling, but remember we always had that big stick ready if we needed it. Ladies and gentlemen, hopefully you got some great notes and hopefully you're going to be ready for that quiz. As always, remember, guys, don't stop learning.